Today's video is going to be about one of my favorite things, resawing, and specifically we'll do the table saws today. I've got a different video on the Raycon bandsaw, but most people don't have a bandsaw. Most people watching this probably have a table saw of some type. I'm going to bring out the Jobsite and the cabinet saw so I can walk you through on both, although it's essentially an identical process. The goal for me today is to produce some blanks to make some box bottoms. So I've got this big 1x12 here that I found at Home Depot that I guess could be best described as having a bunch of bird's eye in it, some pine. I don't know. It may have a different name when it's not in maple or something else. But basically, I need box bottoms that are 7 to 8 inches wide. Now, I could just take this, cut some off, and plane it all down. But that's an extreme waste of wood and a lot of wear and tear on my planer blades. So what I'm going to do instead is we're going to rip this guy straight down the middle, and then we're going to resaw each side. So we're going to get the Jobsite saw done out of the way first. Now it's been a while since I've got this guy out, so hopefully it all works. It's quite covered in dust, but I used this saw for many, many years, and it worked great. And everything I do on my cabinet saw, I did on this saw. It's just much smoother and sometimes less frustrating on the cabinet saw. I gotta see if I can even fit this in here. I think so. I think we can pull this off. Now, the first thing I want to cover is blade choice. We've got a couple different ways we can attack this. If you are looking to have something as close to a book match as possible, we need to remove as little material as possible, so the thinnest thin kerf blade you had is ideal. This is also why if we want a really good book match, we usually use the bandsaw. But we're going to use the table saw for this. And if you have some kind of thin kerf blade, you can get pretty close. In an ideal world, we'd also like as few teeth as possible, as thin and as few teeth as possible. This is hogging out a ton of material, but I generally just use the crappiest blade I have. I just toss in this one that came with the saw stop. It's a bang average crappy blade, worse than a Diablo. I'm not always looking for a perfect book match. If I'm doing it on the table saw, I just know I'm not getting a perfect one in the first place. I'd rather have my beater blade be doing the beater work. This is an activity that's going to heat the blade up a lot. It's going to apply a lot of pressure on the blade. Heat is the enemy of sharpness. It makes things more brittle on the end, duller blade. I'd be willing to bet that if you had one or two identical blades, let's say, and one of them you did only everything else, and one of them you did only resawing, that the resaw blade would be duller quicker than the other blade, hence why I use the crappiest blade I own. It also will get quite dirty, and you got to clean it more often. So even though this isn't ideal, I'm throwing in this 40 tooth blade from SawStop because it's the crappiest blade I own. Up to you though. Ideally, something like a Diablo rip blade or a thin kerf rip blade is going to get you the easiest pass through, especially if you're on like a Jobsite Saw motor, and it's going to give you the closest thing to a book match. Let's talk about the basic plan, things we'd need, things we'd like to have, and how this is going to work. Now, we've only got a maximum of about 3-ish, 3¼ something like that, inches of blade height. Our process is essentially going to be designate one side. We will always keep that towards the fence. We will bring the fence in. We will run it through, raising it a little bit at a time. And we will just keep flipping the board over and over like that to essentially double our height. We're attacking it from both sides, allowing us to get doubled up blade height. You can go with a thicker piece than that, but you will have to do some hand sawing, pull saw, western saw, whatever through the end. I've done it before. I've done it on some long boards and some hardwoods. It's exhausting. I have a very old, crappy pull saw blade that hasn't been changed in like 5 years, so your experience may be a little better. But I often try to keep it to 6 inches or only a little bit over to minimize how much of that I have to do. Hence why I prefer to take a large piece, split it down the middle into something like 4, 4½, 5 inches, rip that, or resaw that, excuse me, and then book match it. Now in terms of what we are going to need, dust mask and eyeglasses. This is one of the messier cuts you can make. Once we get 1 or 2 cuts through there, all of the rest of it is either, if it's not going down there, it's coming straight back out at us. You will have a ton of dust if you don't have good dust collection. And even then, even on the cabinet saw, it eventually still starts shooting out. It's just so much material being removed. You can minimize that by taking smaller and smaller chunks each time, but obviously that takes longer. Now, there are a couple schools of thought on how to hold and manipulate the board when you go through. Some people will get a push stick from the side or a push block from the side and a push stick above, and they will not use their hands at all. I personally do bring a push stick, but I don't use it right away. This is a totally personal choice, and I'm not saying you have to do this or necessarily that you should. Take the safety considerations into consideration and decide for yourself. But the way I do it, and I've been doing it for a long time like this, it just feels more natural to me. is I simply ride my hand up there. I always keep it higher up away from the blade, and I just use my hand over until I get to the very final pass or two when the blade is up pretty high, at which point then when we go through and the final cut is made, this is going to want to fall over, and it's going to be a very skinny piece on the inside if you're starting with something thin. Using a push block or push stick or something on the way out that makes contact with what will be the both sides allows us to finish the cut through and push both sides through so that they fall off of the table saw instead of on the table saw. Sometimes if you don't use this and you don't push it through correctly, one half will just lop on here. You don't want to risk it hitting the blade, any of that. So I do use a push stick for that very final pass, but otherwise you're going to see me use my hands. Some of you may not like that. That's fine. Do it however you wish. In an ideal world, you would have at least one of these, if not two, and stack them. The feather boards are very helpful for this. However, you don't have to have them, and as long as you keep slow, steady, maintaining pressure on there, you're going to get a pretty good cut. What you'll notice is that as you begin cutting, the sides that you cut through will start kind of wanting to pinch in, especially if it's a wide, flat sawn board. It wants to start cupping. And so eventually they will kind of pull in like this and pull in towards the saw blade. This will help maintain the pressure on the bottom because our hand is going to be more up here, and it will allow for a slightly cleaner cut. You'll notice when you get done with the whole thing, it's not going to be perfectly smooth across, even though you've got the same side facing to the fence at all times, because the board does kind of want to cup as it goes through. Little hand plane, little sanding, it takes it out right away. But you're not going to get two perfect pieces ready to use. You're going to have to do a little cleanup, and you'll see that once we do this. Now, I'm not going to use the featherboard on the Jobsite saw, just in case you don't have one. We're going totally bare bones here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rip this straight down the middle to get my separate pieces, and we'll do one of them on here and the other on the cabinet saw. I'm just now realizing I have no outfeed support for this. This bench used to match this saw, but this saw is much lower, so it got lopped off and down. It's going to really help if you have some outfeed support to push it out onto. Obviously, sometimes you just don't, and you got to roll with it. So we're going to roll without it. If you have to let the board fall down and over, that's totally fine. Let it go off of there. You're still going to have to clean it up later anyways. So better safe than sorry. Now that I've got my piece, there are two things I want to say. The first is that I've switched over to a sharper Diablo blade because the motor in this thing was struggling to deal with the slightly dull full kerf blade. However, the next thing is that if you don't need the piece to be long, it's much easier not to do this with a really long piece. It's going to just track easier. Any fluctuations in the board, if you haven't milled it, aren't going to cause problems. So if you have like a 4 foot or 36 or whatever this is, and you don't need that much, don't do that much. Cut this as close as possible to whatever the final length is going to be, and you're going to have a better time getting through there, especially if you're on something like a Jobsite saw where you're going to have to deal with not a ton of table behind the blade. You're all the way out here when you're finished cutting still. So if you can chop it down a little bit. I'm going to chop this down a little bit because there's just, well, I don't need it this long, and it's harder to do this way. If you don't need to do it, don't do it. Taking this down to two pieces, about 14 inches and whatever's left, maybe 18. I would also advise that if you don't need the part of a board that has a knot like on this one, cut this off of there. It's going to slow it down. It's going to gum it up more. I'm going to cut around this as well. It just isn't as smooth going through. So if you don't need the length that includes the knot, chop the knot out if possible. We have two things to do here to prepare. The first is to pick any side, and we're just going to label it the inside. We're just going to write N, and then on the top, I like to draw some arrows all facing that way. And the premise here is that as long as we keep this facing the inside, it will remain a consistent thickness throughout in case our positioning of the fence is not directly in the middle. Therefore, we don't end up with two pieces smaller than what we need them. So pick a side, doesn't matter which one. We're going to put it in. If you've got a side, though, that's flatter, if you don't have a way to mill, I guess I would say if you've got a flatter side, put that in facing the fence. That's going to be better. So I guess it sort of does matter. Now, ideally, we'll find the dead center of this, though I personally like to just kind of guess mark it, and then I like to do just little test nibbles and just see if we're close. So I'm going to bring this in and line it up, dead middle of the tooth. Now, there are two schools of thought here. The first is to do this in many passes, raising the blade maybe only an inch or a half inch at a time. It'll be easier on the motor, easier on the blade. The other school of thought is that you get more clean cuts if you take this in as few passes as possible. I think this depends heavily on the motor in your saw. I would do closer to more passes with less, the smaller the motor in your saw is. I'm not going to go more than an inch or so at a time on this guy. On that one, I usually still go the same amount, but I have gone much more at once and it was okay. This is more just about what can the saw handle? What are you willing to handle? When in doubt, take less at a time and just keep going little bit by little bit up on the saw, flipping it each time until we get through. Remember, our process, flipping through, inside in, get through, come back, inside in, and we just keep going. And just like that, we have now resawn this piece of wood. You can do this with whatever thickness. If you buy 8/4, you can get a bunch of 1/2 inches out of there. Like I said, do this so that I can maximize the amount of wood I use to make the bases. Instead of having just one piece planed down out of all of this, I've now got 2 box bottoms out of the same 12 or 13 inches by buying a wider piece, which is generally cheaper per foot. And I just glue them together like that, book match them, and it's awesome. It's super simple. It's a great way to save money. It's not bad on a job site saw. It really isn't. Obviously, the motor is really your biggest kind of challenge here. The harder and denser the wood, the harder it's going to be to go through there, the more passes you'll have to take, as in raising the blade a little bit more at a time or a little bit less at a time as compared to something with a bigger motor. And this is what I wanted to show you with the blade marks. We're left with a little bit here, 150 grit on the random orbit sander. We'll get that out in seconds. This is what I also mean by when the board starts cupping in, which the wider flat sawn ones love to do, you end up with a part that gets a little closer to the blade and one that's a little further to the blade. So we get this little line that goes down most of this. It's less than a 64th. It'll sand out, or literally 1 or 2 swipes with a hand plane blade will take it out. But you get it really darn clean coming off the saw, all things considered. So let's head over to the cabinet saw and we'll do it on there. It's gonna look almost identical. So if that's all you wanted to see, bye. Moving over to the cabinet saw, and then this is the setup I traditionally use. I grab the feather boards out. I double stack them. If you have these Craig ones, they just barely fit double stacked. So if you don't check yours too, it's possible the bolt is long enough to double stack. 1 is better than none, 2 is better than 1, and so on. A lot of people, like I said, make an auxiliary fence that's taller. I've never found that to be an issue. We're already limited in height by the blade height anyway, so it's not like we're gonna have a 13-inch board doing this. If you have a cup, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, I milled these for this because it's my ideal setup here. But if you have a cup, let's say it's like this, place that hollow up against the fence. If you place it the other way and you change pressure at all, it can rock back and forth and then it'll run into the blade over and over and over again. It's a real mess. You lose material, you get a nastier inside, and it's a little more dangerous. So if you have a cup, place the hollow facing the fence so that it just rides stationary against there and there's no movement. Other than that though, the process is pretty similar. I'm just gonna go through and do these two and you guys can watch. And there we have it, our resawn board. Not exactly a book match, but pretty darn close. We obviously lose more material in the middle with the table saw blade than a bandsaw, but it looks pretty close to the eye. Now, one thing I would say is that before you panel glue these, just take a graze pass on this edge again to get a better glue surface, or run it over the jointer if you want to. I noticed that especially when you're using a rip blade, it tends to pull some fibers out. It's pretty aggressive, so it doesn't leave a nice perfect edge. It will still glue together, but it just doesn't glue as cleanly as if you go back and put a nice clean edge on this, or take a hand plane and just run over it, something to clean it up, and it will glue even better, and it will be just an invisible line. When it comes to the cabinet saw versus the job site saw, it's more about experience, if I put it that way. This motor in here shouldn't be that much bigger than that. It's only a 1.75 horsepower, both are 15 amp motors. I don't know exactly how motor sizes work, but it's not a giant motor. but just the smoothness, the speed, the experience is just so much more comfortable and nicer on a cabinet saw. It's really all it is. The exact operation is the same. We are still doing the exact same steps, putting it through. You can put the featherboards on the Jobsite saw if you have one. There's no difference in how it's done. It's just a nicer experience on the cabinet saw. So don't feel like if you don't have one of these that you can't do this. Hopefully you saw me do it on the Jobsite saw and you will feel comfortable doing it that way. I will say one thing I forgot is how loud those things are compared to this. Jesus, unbelievably loud compared to this. All right, thanks for joining me today. If you have any questions, leave them below. Hopefully that helped. I really think resawing is such a great technique to save wood, to get beautiful book matched bottoms, tops, whatever you want to do. And you can do it right on a table saw, whatever table saw you have. Thanks for joining me today. Bye.